Good evening and welcome back to Checkpoint. We are happy to have your company with us this evening. Ndii and Ndii Kerrow are my guests on set, and we're talking about just some of those sticky areas and issues emerging post a handshake. And Kerrow, let me come to you. We were talking about just before we went on the break. Is the fundamental issue in your view that ODM as a party is Raila Odinga and Raila is ODM? There are people who have said that, so that no matter what other politicians within the party say, when Baba, as he's called, says it is A or right, you best go that direction. If not, then you're outside the party.
Yes, I think it's not only ODM. In all our political parties, we still suffer the big man syndrome. The one who's if the parties are owned.
Are we not seeing more defiance in Jubilee even within the president's backyard?
The only defiance is because between the leader and the deputy leader. And so that one group is with the leader and another because of the politics. But otherwise, when it comes to the crunch, the party leader for Jubilee has summoned them and told them, I want this, and they do it. And we've seen it in many instances. So ODM, yes, ODM is Raila. And Raila is ODM. So ultimately, really, the structures of the political party don't mean much in this country. It's the leader, because the reason why we have the big man syndrome in our political parties is because of the funding. The political parties' funding has not yet properly, taken effect in the country from the government. So what happens is that the political parties are funded through the deep pockets of the leader. So he's the one who calls the shot. And
we're giving ODM some, is it 4 billion I saw they won?
Yeah, they won something, but that's still a long way by the time you go to appeal and so forth. And you know, this is why, but unfortunately, I think just to comment on the issue about the, when two leaders of political parties come together, as in the case of this handshake, and like you said, apart from the fact that it was not structured, it would have really been a matter of goodwill had it not been for the fact that they played some cards on the table and some cards under the table. I mean, it's clear that the cards being played under the table.
Like what? What do you think is under the table?
Well, I wish we knew. It's only the two of them who know.
Yeah.
But the rest of the country can only, speculate, and that's what has happened. And this is why the handshake has been receiving a lot of negative, if you will, reaction from Kenyans, because people see it as those who are supporting deputy, for example, the president, believe that it's targeted at them. Others believe it's about giving jobs to Raila. Others believe it's about giving jobs in future to Uhuru. So the reason why there's all this speculation is because they're playing their cards on the table, really. There isn't much that they have put on the table, except to say we want to unite. And like he said, there isn't much about unity. And they keep talking about the fact that, it's about inclusion, and we want to amend the constitution and try and bring inclusivity. There's no inclusivity even today. They can do it if they want. Look at the appointments being done. All skewed. And what inclusivity are you talking about? The constitution is so clear about inclusivity. For example, regarding appointments, that you must take into account ethnicity. You must take into account regional representation. You must take into account all those factors. But you don't need to amend the constitution to try and say, we want to bring, unless you're talking about bringing the big guys on the table to eat. I mean, really. So I think the political party, that's why we keep folding our political parties to suit that leader's plans.
It's not ideological.
You remember PNU?
Yeah.
It was set up 90 days before the election. TNA, 90 days before the election. Jubilee, the same thing happened.
I bet you in 2022
and 2022, all these things will be off the board. You'll get a new outfit the boss wants. The boss will wake up and say, I want this one now. And you've had already some people within the Jubilee saying, look, we'll have something new. So you won't be surprised. So it's not about a political, there's no ideology, there's no structure. It's about where the boss wants, and it's a vehicle for getting to power. After you get to power, it no longer matters really. The boss will determine what to do. And that's why you get that perception that ODM is all about Raila, and they can't really do much.
Did you agree with that view? And also talk to us about, then should Kenyans look at the handshake as purely something that benefits two gentlemen. That for Uhuru Kenyatta, the president managed to neutralize, vanquish an erstwhile enemy, and now has him as a cooperator. For Raila Odinga, as you've talked about, in government, all the trappings of power is what he's enjoying now, but it really has nothing to do with Kenyans.
I think what we see in the handshake now is the politics of self-preservation. Because, as I said, you can look at three things. We had a roadmap for electoral justice. Then you had the MOU, what is written on paper, and then you have the practice that we are observing. Now, if you go to the roadmap, our roadmap envisaged a transitional arrangement where Raila and Uhuru would lead a transitional arrangement, a traditional government. That transitional government would do reforms, and both Raila and Uhuru would retire in 2022, having midwifed reforms. Okay, so there would be referees in the 2022 election. And if they did that, they would have had a lot of goodwill if they announced. And so that there's a bit of confusion, because when we talk about the referendum we were talking about at the beginning, and the referendum which is being talked about now is not the same. Because the referendum we were talking about was to create a transitional government instrument. In the same way that after the PEV, we had a transitional government instrument, the one which created the government of national unity. But that was under the old constitution. Under the new constitution, that needs to go to a referendum. That could have been done without going to a referendum. You couldn't do it without going to a referendum. It was not a referendum for constitutional reforms. So that would have created a transitional government instrument. Reforms would have been worked out under that transitional government. There would have been a referendum now to implement those reforms if necessary. But hopefully, we had hoped that would be uncontentious, because the whole country would have been behind them.
Together.
And because Raila and Uhuru would have been referees, Ruto and Musalia and all the others would have run the election. There would be no need for this antagonism that we are seeing now. The roadmap, or rather the MOU, was a non-state process. It said very clearly that this is personal. Raila and Uhuru will lead a non-state process outside government to reconcile Kenyans. But then they created the Building Bridges Task Force, which is a state instrument because it was gazetted. So already you see the movement. It was not, the MOU did not envisage a task force going around collecting views for constitutional reform. It envisaged Raila and Uhuru leading a national dialogue. They haven't done that. We tried to push them very hard. I certainly tried to push the Raila side very hard to set up a structure that would facilitate that kind of dialogue.
What would it have looked like?
It would have looked like something outside of government.
Right.
Probably something like with the Serena process, but staying outside of government.
Okay.
With participation of civil society and church leaders and also people, Ufungaman, all those people. It would not have been a secret task force of bureaucrats and all manner of people. We don't know what they are doing. There's no conversation. And I raised these questions. Is Uhuru committed to this sort of process? And then there was a lot of pushback. And that's the point I said, okay, this is not what I signed up for, and left. Then you have now the practice. What you see in practice is Raila championing Jubilee agenda. Okay? And pushing his party, sort of like whipping his party to do that, and being an envoy and all manner of things on his own. So what you see is not a transitional agenda, but in fact a succession agenda. So what you see is the politics of self-preservation, which seem meant to ensure that Uhuru and his constituency will continue to play a role beyond the end of his term. And part of that seems either to be able to take William Ruto out of the equation, or to force him to be part of whatever sort of animal that they want to create. And then the constitutional referendum has become one of probably trying to create political accommodation, as opposed to dealing with the electoral justice problem that brought us into this situation in the first place.
Right.
That's what I see from where I sit.
Okay, so you've severed ties, as I come to you.
Absolutely.
You've severed ties with ODM, with the former Prime Minister?
I was not part of ODM. I came in to support the establishment of a national coalition, united opposition. I said that in public at Bomas. I was really not there to whatever. Okay. And then when obviously that the agenda we were pursuing ended, and it became a sort of agenda where he's talking about, which has got some cards under the table. I don't want to work with cards which are under the table.
All right.
So I said, I left.
But I think even the information he's just revealed that there was in that structured arrangement that they wanted, they wanted a transitional government to be headed by Uhuru and Raila. I think that even that aspect of the, if you will, ODM or its opposition or NASA, whatever arrangement, has never been made public. That there was, or whether there was an MOU, in fact, between Uhuru and Raila. All that Kenyans know today is that two people agreed on something, and they said this is what we agreed. But I think it's important that it's coming out that there was an MOU and that there was a plan for a transitional sort of government between Raila and this is why perhaps there's been a lot of reaction to it from the Deputy President's side, perhaps because of that fact. But I think this is the problem we have in this country, that when MOUs or this kind of arrangements are done, they are never made public.
The 9-point agenda, they'd argue, was the MOU.
No, that's not an MOU.
The MOU is the 9-point agenda.
That's a task. That was terms of reference.
The 9-point agenda, if you go to the end of it, that's the MOU. That's it is signed by the two gentlemen at the end. And if you read it carefully, it is what I'm saying. You see, let me clarify.
Yeah.
If we were going into a structured arrangement, we would have had NASA negotiating with Jubilee.
Right.
So William Ruto and Uhuru would have been on that side. So yeah, and Raila and Kalonzo and Musalia and Wetangula and their technical team would have been on this side. That's what we meant by a structured process.
Okay.
But Raila and Uhuru abandoned both their political parties and government, went and cut a deal. Okay, came out with this document, and they said no, we are going to deal this as leaders. We are not going to deal with this as political parties and political process. We are going to deal with it as national leaders. After all, these challenges we inherited them from our fathers. The document says as much, isn't it? So we said, okay, if you're going to go out and reconcile Kenyans, power to you. Okay? So you're going to reconcile Kenyans. Then as soon as they finish saying they're going to reconcile Kenyans, they turn on William Ruto. Then I ask, if you are trying to reconcile Kenyans, you should be reconciling all Kenyans. So why are you turning on William Ruto?
Okay.
Look at our, all
right.
So those are the contradictions I'm talking about. Because William Ruto should have been on the table in a structured negotiation as a deputy president and the deputy leader of Jubilee. And we should have been on the other side. And we should have hammered out how we are going to navigate ourselves out of that crisis created by the 2017 election. So I call we had said we don't want a boardroom deal. We want a public deal. I call what we have a barroom deal.
A barroom?
Yeah, it wasn't a boardroom deal.
It wasn't even a boardroom.
Okay, before you comment.
I just wanted to mention that, you see, this BBI thing, really, it's not based on any legal or constitutional framework or architecture in this country. I mean, there is a process that this country has always followed when we are amending our constitution or when we are. If you look at it, the way it's just the two gentlemen simply sat down and agreed on something and said, we are setting up this thing and funding it, and it goes. I mean, it's something that, frankly, it undermines the if you will, the constitution, the spirit of the constitution, because when you are in the constitution, we have got a significant amount of issues on values that as a country we should follow, in fact including trying to bring together people and so forth. But the way you set up as two individuals of two political parties, that this is what we want and these are the gentlemen who are going to do it, and you go around and collect views, I don't think it was done really in the. This is why that perception is there, that there are cards under the table.
Under the table.
Yeah.
I want to wrap up for our viewers watching us on KTN Home. That's all the time we had for you this evening, but you can switch over to KTN News where this conversation continues right now. Right. So, to the point you're making, Kerrow, then, is that the politicians have been disingenuous in that, in your view, these are issues that can be canvassed with the laws we have right now, and these are some of the things do not even need laws to fix. For instance, inclusivity, and the president attended women's meeting, development of the women agenda in Canada the other day. And it still continues to be a glaring issue that his cabinet does not meet the not more than 2/3 gender rule, and that's a appointive position. As a country, we risk the Chief Justice dissolving Parliament because of all the failed attempts again to fix the same. So then where does that leave Kenya then?
In my view, we have a very good constitution.
Yeah.
You don't need to amend anything in this constitution. It's about failure to implement the constitution. The problems we are having, forget about these stories, we want to strengthen the devolution. If the government implemented this constitution, devolution would be far off today. Many of the challenges we have of the government borrowing and being in crisis is because the government has not implemented this constitution as required. For instance, if you take the devolution alone, there are many government functions, national government, that should have been devolved to the county governments, and they know it. And we've tried for years. Please, this is not your function. Even where the functions have been devolved, you find national government is still wanting to do some of the things. Example is the water supply. Many of the water supply functions have been devolved. National government has no business putting up 1,000 cubic meters dam. You know, as they mentioned the other day, putting up thousands of dams all over the place. Or they have no business buying medical equipments and things for hospitals. Over 98% of the functions of the medical health services have been devolved. So the constitution really has addressed many of these challenges. It's about implementation. We have no fidelity to the constitution. So what happens is that we are always looking for some legal excuse that, you know, oh, this happened, yes, we need law. This country, for heaven's sake, is over-regulated. We have every statute you can think of. And they're there. For example, these appointments we mentioned a few minutes ago, the National Cohesion and Integrity, I think, Act, if I'm not wrong, is very clear on how appointments are supposed to be done, and including what percentage should come from one ethnic community and, you know, maximum in any appointments that are done. The issue of women and the issue of, you know, of other marginalized, whatever, in the Constitution. These things are very elaborate. So we don't want to implement the Constitution, and we keep saying that, you know, there's a problem. So it's not really. So I think many of us get the perception that this attempt to try and create BBI, it's a backroom door to try and amend the Constitution. And I don't think, unless the government's you know, wants to use the Vifaranga story again, I don't see how anybody would convince Kenyans that after they come up with the questions for the referendum, how you can convince Kenyans that there's need to amend this constitution for the purpose of Wanjiku.
Yeah.
You can't. Look at what's happened in this country in the last 3 years, 2 years. Every action the government has taken has been to put pressure on the cost of living of ordinary Kenyans. Really. Everything. Try to make things difficult. And recently one of the Jubilee senators actually was frustrated, and he said, is this government at war with its citizens? and you get that perception. You know, they don't seem to be in touch with the reality that people are already suffering. You're bringing one rule after another. You increase the taxes. You know, this rule, no second-hand vehicles. You can't bring spares. You have to pay, you know. Yeah. It's crazy. Like, people are suffering out there, but the government doesn't seem to be in touch with what's going on. And so tomorrow, if you bring an amendment to the Constitution that will create more burdens, create more positions, or create more burden for the people, I don't see Kenyans really going through with that.
I wonder what you make, Ndii, whether Raila Odinga, as party leader of the Orange Democratic Movement, the party that's a minority in Parliament, is accountable to Kenyans? Because I saw a debate one of the times on social media where I think it was Patrick Gadara who was calling and asking for questions, what happened to all the issues he raised about whether it was the SGR, the Eurobond at the time during the campaigns, and now silence on those issues. So is it a legitimate question when people want to know, okay, you had these issues on SGR, now you're supporting government on extension of something from the very beginning you had a huge, big problem with. Is that a concern that's valid, or is he, because he's not an elected member, don't ask him questions? You support perhaps those of his supporters who say that it's not just Raila's job to oppose. If you want to oppose, you go ahead and oppose yourself.
It's the confusion created by the institutional sort of dysfunction I've mentioned.
Right.
Because, as I said, in a presidential system, the party gives you a ticket as a presidential candidate. You actually run your campaign as a presidential campaign. Mm-hmm. Once the party gives you a ticket, if you look at the US, which is where we've copied this, it gives you a ticket, you go off and set up a presidential campaign. The party goes back to fight for its seats in Congress, because that's what the separation, the essence of presidential system is separation of legislature and executive. So you go off to fight to become a president and and the parties go back to look for seats and governorships and all sorts of things. And if you don't win, like Hillary Clinton, you go home. And you decide whether you're going to contest again, then you go to the primaries again or not. Mm-hmm. But you are out of the scene. And it is now the party in the Congress and the leadership of the party in Congress that is the is the minority, or it can be majority. It is not even tied to because you can have a majority which is not the same as the executive. Okay? In the parliamentary system, executive and majority are joint in parliament. They both come from parliament. Okay? So now that's the confusion that we are having. Because in a pure presidential system, Raila Odinga should be out of the scene. And of course, the institution is then complicated by our electoral crisis of 2017, which has kept him on the scene. Yeah? And then again, instead of having a structured institutional process, as I said, you have a personalized attempt to resolve these, which gives them him informal sort of state, sort of position. So it's a peculiar situation. It's not easy to be able to answer yes or no, whether he should be accountable or he shouldn't. But the informality of what him and who are doing using public resources is certainly questionable. Okay. But unfortunately, the people who would question is the legislature. But because of our personalized big man syndrome, the legislature has now become a rubber stamp. It cannot actually be able to do that.
Even publicly, there is accountability from the minority because they are funded. The minority party leadership is funded through the taxpayers. The leader of official majority, the leader of the minority whip, and all the leadership in the minority, they enjoy benefits by virtue of their position because they are expected to be, as a minority leader, to be opposition. That's why they have got offices and cars and they get, funding for that completely. And because of that, they are accountable to the people of Kenya because they are getting resources to carry out their mandate of holding the government or the ruling party to account. So if they fail to do so, I agree with that argument about Mother Gadara, they ought to, apart from the presidential candidate, but the leadership in parliament is accountable. That's why they are being given offices, that's why they are given resources, that's why they are funded. Just like, they enjoy all those trappings and all those benefits. The idea is so that they can carry out their mandate effectively. The Constitution really provides for that. So when they don't, and they become an appendage of the executive, or they become part of the ruling party, as happened now, then I think they should be held to account.
So then, would you say opposition in Kenya is dead? And keeping in mind, you have the likes of Musalia Mudavadi, who time and again, he has kept up with the national issues, addresses the media, even gives what he, in his view, are alternatives or proposals of what needs to be done. But there are those who argue he doesn't have the political muscle, not the gravitas of, again, Raila Odinga. So is political opposition in its real sense what it's supposed to be?
When we talk of opposition, it's the elected leadership who have been deemed to be opposition by virtue of the number of votes they've won or seats they've won. And in this case, the minority party leadership. That is the opposition. Not me and him and Mudavadi, the people who have not been elected, who are out there, or civil society, or the media. These are not opposition. The opposition, you know, the understanding in politics about opposition are those people who have been elected to parliament, who did not form government, but are there.
Then to rephrase my question, to keep government to account, can those kind of voices still manage to do it, to hold government to account, to the checks and the balances, now that the avenue that is provided by the Constitution appears not to be working? So the likes of Mudavadi, Kuru Okot and his proposals around change of law, can those work?
Oh yes, that's the alternative voices that have worked always, the media, the civil society. These are the people who have always, not only in Kenya, but in many governments in this world, these are the people who hold governments to account.
Can they work really? Do they have significance?
We need to recognize
that
we have created this animal called pre-election coalitions. So we formed a coalition. The opposition, the minority in parliament is NASA. Because we formed a formal pact and we deposited that instrument to the Register of Political Parties. I was leading that process in the sense of putting the technical things together. Now, so the leaders of those parties actually are the custodians of that pact. So in a sense, Musalia Mudavadi, as the leader of ANC, actually in this mongrel sort of system of ours we have created, does have a say, because he's the leader of a political party which is part of that coalition. So he's the leader of those members of ANC who are in parliament, and Raila as well. And that's the thing I'm describing as an anomaly, because coalitions are creatures of parliamentary systems, and they are post-election. First of all, you have an election. If no party has an absolute majority, then parties come together to form government. The situation which you have a coalition formed before the election to win the presidency, and then it goes into parliament and it is not in government, is quite an anomaly, because it doesn't need to be an anomaly. Coalitions are formed after elections so that the government can have a majority. Now we have a coalition which is in parliament for no sort of functional reason other than it was formed to try and win the executive power, and it is now a remnant of that failed attempt to win executive power, and it may not even survive in fact there is provision of how we can dissolve it before the next election. So the problem is that we have not been able to design a multi-party system which works. There's a phrase you will be hearing a lot in the coming days called consociational democracy. This is the thinking which is coming along from Western powers, that these ethnically divided societies like ours, these sort of adversarial politics cannot work. And what you need is ethnic coalitions of all tribes, what you call big tent politics, like they had in Malaysia under UMNO for a very long time, so that you actually don't have an opposition. So again, it's almost back to one party. One party system.
What we call negotiated democracy.
Yes, consociational democracy. There's something he said about fidelity to the Constitution. And that is really the fundamental issue, because there's an interview that Uhuru Kenyatta did during the election, and he said, and I recall that he said, that the problem is, he was trying to explain why he hadn't done as much as he could have during his first term, and he said the problem is the Constitution. Under the old Constitution, he would have been able to do more. Remember, we passed the new Constitution so that we can devolve and diffuse power from this over-centralized overbearing executive. Uhuru doesn't believe in it. So what he's describing and what you're seeing, the lack of that fidelity to the Constitution, is because of not believing in that Constitution. And what you're seeing is clawing back. All those things are attempts to claw back power.
Okay.
That's why devolution is a problem. You see, because it's the main sort of institutional innovation that's doing that. And what you're seeing under the handshake, in fact, suggests that we are seeing a replay of 1964, when again we had a constitution with very diffused power. Kanu did not like it, and therefore it forced, it sort of strangled both devolution and the opposition, and forced everybody back into one big tent, which became a one-party state.
Right.
And that looks like where we are headed. I mean, that's what looks like what the real cards under the table of the handshake actually are.
So before we wrap up, we must talk about the other side. I think we've dwelt a lot on the opposition side, but as they shook hands and talked about unity, disunity started growing within Jubilee, and now Kileweke and Tangatanga is what the groups within are referred to, the camps there. How does this, in your view, affect governance when the president and his deputy are pulling different directions?
I think it does obviously affect the running of government, and we've seen it already in the way the two sides have taken opposing views on some of the policies or decisions of the government. But I think, in my view, really, the buck stops with the president. I mean, you are the leader of the party, and you are the leader of the country. So to the extent that you are not able to give direction to your own party, and by extension to your own government, says a lot, really. And you can't, so clearly you will see from what is going on in Jubilee some lack of leadership. It's apparent that there is that lack of leadership to, somebody not stamping his authority and saying, no, let us have this, and this is what we want to do. He says no politics, and politics goes on.
So what can he
wants corruption. Corruption is not a problem. He's told off. Really, so it's not about, some people have given the argument that, he's lame duck because he's on his last term. I don't think that's the case. I think the president still has immense powers, by the way, certainly with regards to the government, if not the party, at least with those executives. He has powers. There's nothing that stops the president to send his executive home tomorrow and reconstitute a new one. And for example, in this war on corruption, there are countries that do not focus on the legal aspects. If it's corruption at that level of cabinet and very civil, you send a message by sending people home. It's enough for you to be ashamed in the media and being fired. It's enough. There are countries like Sweden, I know, that do not. For the last 50 years, they haven't taken any senior government officer to court, because they believe that if you have been fired and if you have been exposed, it's enough punishment, and you don't need to. So for the president, for example, to argue that no, I have to follow the rule of law with regards to how his executive works, well, I think clearly it means that he is unable to really rein in the team. And so it's unfortunate the country suffers, because then when people pull in different directions, then policy is affected. Implementation, you see the president saying one day no more new projects, the next day his deputy is launching new projects. You don't understand what exactly where this country is going, and so even within government now there's confusion. If you ask at some level, they don't know whom to deal with. If you deal with one side, you are told, my friend, you are on our wrong side, so you are going to be blacklisted. And so people are really walking a tightrope in government, especially senior officers who have to deal with with the executive at that level. So I don't think, I think it's a shame, but frankly, there are many in this country who now think that Jubilee is a letdown, and by extension, really the presidency, because that's where the buck stops.
Right.
That this country, people feel let down in this, not only in the war on corruption, but in many of the things that happen. There's no direction, it's a pity that We don't see authority.
Authority
in the
being
party,
stamped.
yes,
Yeah.
or in government.
I wonder what you make of the same, Ndii, and also keeping in mind that there are those who now have argued that in fact the more vibrant opposition that has been seen in the country is within the president's party.
I think corruption is a good lens to view this.
Yeah.
The lame duck politics and all of that. I think the problem with corruption and the presidency is twofold. One is one which I actually raised right here when we had that conversation, that the war on corruption has been weaponized for politics. And once we weaponize it for politics, you obviously divided the people into, you're fighting, sort of two camps. I remember I raised that, I said that's a risk. It's a danger.
Yes.
Because you could win the war on corruption, but you could not, maybe you may not win the war on politics. So you mix the two, you conflict, you undermine it. It always sort of blows back when you weaponize the anti-corruption for politics. The second one, and why you should not have done it in the first place, is the president himself is conflicted. Because this corruption he's trying to fight happened when he was in office, during his first term. It was done by his people. Okay? He did not do anything then. So it's very difficult to turn around and start sort of digging into things which have happened under your watch. And the buck stops with you.
He says they want vigilante justice.
Yeah, that's fine. But first of all, he says he's going to fight this, and then he turns around now. 4 or 5 years ago, he walked into parliament with a piece of paper waving with all sort of names of people. And then he went ahead and sort of nothing came out of that. So basically, the thing with him is that he cannot demonstrate resolve. I say he's conflicted. He's a beneficiary of the political benefits of why that corruption has been done. He is a beneficiary of financial corruption scandals that we know of. Okay? So he can be blackmailed. People know, people close to him, and thinks he's a beneficiary of. And when he goes after them, they pull out the yellow card, as people are saying. So he's been shown the yellow card a couple of times, and then he's pulled back. And he was not always the most courageous person when it comes to taking the bull by the horns. So mixed signals, politicizing it.
Yeah.
It was bound to fail. I mean, this was sort of doomed. I don't even think it was serious. What it was meant to was for political purposes.
Okay.
And that political purpose has not worked.
Right.
So it is probably a person from the president's own camp told me after the State of the Nation address that was a white flag on corruption. He's thrown in the towel.
Wow. Wow. Final words, 30 seconds. Our time is up. Your final thoughts in as far as everything we've talked about, what you see as the way forward?
No, I think this country deserves better, really. If there's anyone who has enjoyed the goodwill of the people, really, this president did. And it's unfortunate that, the years are going by and that goodwill is really eroding very fast. And today the challenges Kenyans face, it's about survival, really. The cost of living, millions of Kenyans are struggling to stay alive. The economy, don't look at this Nairobi Stock Exchange. The rest of the economy is suffering, really, suffering, and people are, every businessman is complaining, and the government does not seem to be focused on that. And right. By and large, you find the government, even this currency thing, you'll find that the small businesses are going to be hit. They're going to be hit. It's not about corruption. If government wants to focus on corruption, they know where the corruption money is. I mean, you don't expect those big guys, their money to be hidden. They put it in banks. It's not a big deal. Any bank, all the commercial banks can launder money for you. It's not a big deal for a fee. They have done it. The NYS money has been done in the elections. Hundreds, tens of billions were being transacted cash.
Okay.
So but look at what is going to happen to these small people who have to deal in cash day to day. So I think, in my view, this government really is a letdown. and on the hopes of Kenyans. And unfortunately, the guy who had given that alternative in the elections, Raila, has not helped matters by being part of the system. He's just being viewed now by many Kenyans as being part of the system. And so we have a situation where Kenyans are more or less feeling helpless. One exposure after the other. You feel every day is a sad news. Yes.
Okay.
We become more or less helpless. And we've been numbed by all these exposures to the point where some of us don't even react anymore to it. You just throw in the towel and say, wachana nayo.
Well, we cannot be hopeless. I hope we will not get to that. We must we must keep talking, discussing, and hopefully at some point some change. Hopefully, David Ndii Kerrow, thank you for being with us here.